All right, so good morning for you who are in Europe or in the UK, and good evening for Koreans probably. Welcome to the International Roundtable on Will Korea be the first country to introduce universal basic income. My name is Won Lee. I'm a moderator today, and I'm the CEO of Lab 2050. Lab 2050 is an independent policy think tank based in Seoul, Korea, and we do policy experiments. So we are now conducting a research project on a UBI pilot in a rural community with 3,000 residents in Korea. So we are doing that. And also, this event is organized and hosted by Korea Inequality Research Lab and Lab 2050 together, and we decided to hold this together under this particular question because clearly there's the ruling party presidential candidate Lee Jae-myung in Korea who has a UBI plan in his campaign platform for 9th March presidential election in Korea. So today, timetable is as follows. Time is pretty tight, so I'm trying to make it quick. So first of all, Dr. Jiun Choi will briefly introduce the UBI plan of Lee Jae-myung with her comment, and Professor Jong-sung Yu will briefly raise questions to discuss. And we already shared the paper on the possibility of UBI in Korea, which is written by Dr. Yu and Choi together. So you might have already read it. And then panel discussion will follow. Professor Philip Van Parijs, Dr. Malcolm Torrey, Professor Jung Lee, and Professor Namun Kang will participate. If time allows, panel discussion will take 2 turns. And finally, Professor Jong-sung Yu and Dr. Jiun Choi will respond to panel comments. So after that, we'll take comments and questions from online participants. So let's begin. So first of all, let me introduce Dr. Jiun Choi, adjunct professor of Seoul National University and former economist at World Bank. Dr. Choi, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Let me share the presentation slide. Can you see the slide well?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
I can see that.
Thank you. Yes, we wrote a short policy piece, not necessarily an academic piece, together, myself and together with the Professor Jong-sung Yu, about will Korea be the first country to introduce universal basic income? And I want to just show you that what is Lee's, the candidate Lee from the Democratic Party, what he is currently proposing to implement in Korea for next 5 years is a basic income plan. So I just want to mention that the social economic background about Korea. So as you know, we are one of the success of the economic history. We had a very rapid industrialization, but we are also a victim of our own success. We have a growing inequality, and then the government spending on welfare or the social area, the public spending is only around 11%, but versus like the average of the OECD country is about 22%. And we have a relatively smaller the government debt to GDP ratio under 50%, even after increasing a lot of fiscal spending throughout the COVID, since the COVID outbreak. So high growth, but also very high growing rate of the inequality. And at the same time, relatively low spending of government on welfare or public area, but have a relatively low level of debt. So all of those provide the basis that Korea is actually have a room to provide more public spending, and it is actually required to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. And also, given the rapid digitalization and technological changes, and the future of job is also uncertain. So I think the big government, such as government intervention through the UBI, is widely discussed worldwide, but that is particularly important in Korea in the current socio-economic background. But when Lee Jae-myung, when he first introduced about his plan for UBI initially, even the very beginning of this election, myself was very pessimistic if that is possible to, if Korea can actually adopt the UBI nationwide with the large amount of amount that he initially proposed as even before became a candidate, because of given the fiscal space. But when after we received a lot of controversies and criticism, we are forced to revise the plans several times, and then now the final plan has been outlined in this slide. And in my view, this is quite a practical way, a practical approach to implement the UBI. Instead of having a large amount in front, we want to have a rather gradual implementation. And in a certain area, also a certain age group, when you start, but conditional on people's agreement, we want to expand it nationwide. That way, we can also deal with those controversy and those people who are against about UBI, and also we can also minimize potential side effects of introducing UBI, because we do not really know what happened for other countries, because it's almost the first case. Korea is almost the first case. So Lee's plan today, Lee wants to introduce UBI for all Korean, but starting with a relatively small amount in the first year, but he will expand it to 4 times more, but in 4 installments per year within his term, but on conditional on public approval. For that, we are going to establish a universal basic income committee, and then we'll build a people's consensus before we actually expand. But he wants to start from the beginning of his term. He wants to start the UBI for a certain age group, youth, also people living in the rural area, also for artists, and as well as some allowances, such as children's allowances and then senior allowances, etc. Those already existed, but we want to expand the amount and also the age group. So those are what we are building on from the existing allowances. So some of those, we made the financing plan, and then those are outlined here, but mostly we want to use the existing budget, but for when we build it nationwide, we want to introduce new taxes such as carbon emission and the land holding taxes. So there are several policy debates around the UBI today in Korea. First, the major one is, should we actually, does it make sense for the government to support, give a cash to CEO of Samsung when there are more poor people who need a cash or who need a help? So that's about universal or targeted. Also, there is another policy debate around it, why UBI is needed, particularly in Korea, when it has not been tested anywhere else. So we do not know what's going to be consequences or evidence. And also, another very popular policy debate is it financially feasible, or can we afford? And also, if once UBI is introduced, will it be financial burden on the youth for the long term? So those are the current debates around the UBI. I will give it to the next round to the Professor Yu.
Okay. I am actually excited about the prospect of Korea being the first country in the world to introduce universal basic income. I first heard about the concept of universal and unconditional basic income from Professor Philip van Parijs when he was a visiting professor at Harvard University and gave a lecture. As a doctoral candidate in public policy, specializing in inequality and social policy, I was struck by this simple and innovative idea. As I learned more...
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Dr. Che, please unshare your presentation.
Oh, sure.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. As I learned more about the idea of basic income, I came to think that basic income could save the current welfare state from its conundrums. Basic income is fair and just. Basic income frees the people or gives real freedom to people. Also, basic income is efficient, unlike traditional social welfare, which often traps people in poverty. However, the prospect of South Korea becoming the first UBI country, or the fact that universal basic income has never been implemented elsewhere, poses special challenges for the proponents of UBI in Korea, especially politicians. Critics and skeptics ask why we should run such an expensive experiment on Korean citizens before knowing the effects of UBI thoroughly. Perhaps it was unwise for a presidential candidate to propose creating new taxes such as land value tax and carbon tax to finance UBI. In fact, many politicians within Democratic Party were worried that electoral pledge of increasing taxes to finance UBI would be a political suicide. Although we have criticized politicians who pledged to expand social welfare without increasing taxes, perhaps we should acknowledge that they were wise, while Lee Jae-myung is not wise. Yoon Suk-yeol, the People Power Party's presidential candidate, strongly opposes universal basic income. However, the People Power Party, PPP's platform endorses basic income. Oh Se-hoon, mayor of Seoul, affiliated with the PPP, and Yoo Seung-min, who ran unsuccessfully for the nomination of the presidential candidate for the party, they proposed different versions of negative income tax. Basic income and the negative income tax share considerable similarities, although I believe that universal basic income is better than negative income tax. I think Lee Jae-myung's proposed presidential commission on basic income could consider different versions of negative income tax as well as basic income, and find a scheme of UBI or negative income tax that the greatest number of Koreans can agree with. Do you think it is a good idea to consider various versions of negative income tax as well as basic income in the Presidential Commission on Basic Income? Or we should not consider negative income tax as a possible option? So these are some of the questions we want to discuss together with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yu. So I think now he raised very important questions. So we are going to hear comment from panels. So could we start with Professor Van Parijs?
Yes, good morning, everyone. And I was asked in particular to say what I would say to Koreans who are skeptical about Governor Lee's proposals. And of course, with all the modesty that befits someone who doesn't know the Korean situation as much as you do, I think I would have mainly two things to say to my fellow Koreans if I were a Korean. The first one is that Governor Lee's proposals are a set of proposals. It's not a single one. And each of them must also be evaluated, discussed separately. For example, the idea of extending the child allowance from the age of 8 to age of 18 is something that exists already in many countries in the world, and on which there is a very wide consensus that every single child, not only up to age 8, but up to adulthood, should receive it. Secondly, there is this idea of extending it to a later age, the 19 to 29. That doesn't exist anywhere in the world, to my knowledge, certainly not in that pure form. But there has been some modest experiment in that direction in Governor Lee's province. And there are a number of countries where there is already something looking like it. For example, in my own country, in Belgium, these child benefits are received up to the age of 26, but only for the people who are in full-time education. But there are proposals, including by parties in the current federal government in Belgium, to extend it to all young people up to the age of 26, because that would be fair. That it would be fair not to restrict that privilege to the people who manage to go to a university. Then there is the proposal, thirdly, the proposal of extending this basic income to some categories, like the rural population or the artists, again, in a pure form that doesn't exist elsewhere, but there are some approximations, and there may be some reasons in the Korean context to give a privilege to this part of the population, especially as it would consist in part for the rural population in a sort of rationalization or an expansion of what already exists. And then finally, to give a fourth example among the many proposals, there is this idea of a real universal basic income for everyone, funded at least partly by a carbon tax or by the fees to be paid for emission rights. Now, this doesn't exist anywhere in the world. It would be an innovation, but it is very widely proposed in the world today, including by about 1,000 economists, if I remember, in this letter to the published by Wall Street Journal in, I think it was in February 2020. And so that in the context of the fight to try to address the climate change challenge, this makes a lot of sense and is defended widely. And so obviously it would be good if a country took that important step and thereby showed the example to the rest of the world. So the first thing I would say to my fellow, my compatriots, if I were a Korean citizen, would be don't dismiss the plan as a whole. Look at each of the proposals separately, evaluate the pros and cons, and then you may find that at least some of these ideas are really very good ones, which you are able to support. And then the second thing I would say would be to draw attention also to the general vision behind this set of proposals, because they form a coherent whole. And I would tell them, have you heard of the huge challenges that are presented by technical innovation, by climate change, and what these mean for rising inequalities and for rising insecurity? Don't you think that we need a model of a future society that will provide basic economic security to all in a way that does not kill incentives to work, in a way that facilitates systematically lifelong learning, which we badly need, and which makes our societies and our economies more productive, not by exploiting the fear of starvation, but by exploiting the power of freedom. And once you are aware of the challenges, then even if you don't agree with every detail of the proposal, which will need to be fine-tuned anyway, including within the context of the Basic Income Commission, which was mentioned before, even if you don't agree with the basic, with the details of the proposal, you may agree with the general vision and think and be convinced that this is really the direction in which we need to go.
Thank you very much for the thorough comment. So it was Professor Van Parijs, and now we are going to invite Dr. Malcolm Torrey for a comment.
I think this is an extremely useful proposal from a presidential candidate, and I think those who have created it should be congratulated not only on a secure vision, but also a practical approach to it. The proposal, as I understand it, builds on existing pilot projects. That is, it has been tried in a city and in a province in a minor way amongst a single age group. That is a very good basis on which to start. It intends a slow evolution towards more substantial payments. That's also a very practical approach. And it has similarities to Alaska's permanent funds dividend. And so in that sense, there has been a test elsewhere in the world, and quite a long-term one as well. Well, as I understand it, Korea would not be looking at a universal weekly or monthly payment, which is what is normally understood by a basic income, but rather an annual payment or a quarterly one. And that's what's been tested in the 24-year-old project in a city and a province. And so you have a lot to build on. And I think you should take a great deal of encouragement from that you're not in one sense starting from scratch. You are building on existing experience. That's an extremely useful thing to do. You also have a clear funding method, and it is a perfectly feasible one if it can gather sufficient public approval for it. I shall come to that later if there's more time. I have a couple of questions, and one of those relates to the categories of individuals who will receive enhanced basic incomes. I have a question about artists, and I do question whether it's a very good idea. The question, looking at it in the UK context, who is an artist is a question which would not be easy to address, and it would embroil the project in unimaginable bureaucratic complexity, in subjective decision-making, and a case-by-case approach. If any of this project is to be jettisoned at any point, it should probably be that, because the whole idea of a basic income is its unconditionality. That's what makes it work. And to say that artists receive it imposes a considerable condition on the payment. What would really work is the main proposal for a basic income, a regular payment to every individual, and that is, I think, where you need to concentrate. I would like to suggest that this would. I'm now going to address some of the questions that you've just asked. First of all, inequality. Basic income is an extremely good method for tackling inequality because it is very simple, and at the same time it provides a greater proportion of income to low-income households than to higher income households, and therefore begins to reduce inequality. It may seem counterintuitive that the same payment to every individual will reduce inequality, but of course it will. It avoids targeting, and you asked the question as to whether a targeted approach might be preferable. The answer has to be no, on the basis of the experience of countries with welfare systems based on targeting. We trap people in poverty. It's very difficult to earn your way out of poverty if benefits go down when earned income goes up. And therefore, and the basic income your proposal avoids that problem. It is the significant problem. So I firmly encourage you to pursue the universal and unconditional direction of your proposal. You mentioned the idea of a negative income tax. It is felt to be similar to a basic income because it can generate the same relationship between earned income and disposable net income. And that is why people often confuse the two. They are radically different. Basic income is a payment to every individual unconditionally. A negative income tax has to have significantly complex administration attached to it because it is a negative income tax. And our research on these possibilities is that the complexity of a negative income tax makes it an impossible proposition. When Milton Friedman first proposed a negative income tax, he recognized in his proposal that there would be administrative challenges. He never addressed them. And they really do look impossible challenges to meet. And if anybody wants further information on that, then I'm very happy to provide it. Why is it needed? You need to reduce inequality. That's why it's needed. And it will address the insecurity of incomes that so many countries are now facing. You say that the idea hasn't been tested. Well, of course it has in Alaska. Korea is an excellent place to test this. If you manage to implement your proposal, you will do the entire global basic income debate a huge favor, because you'll be testing something that we could then research, and a great deal of educational material will be produced for other countries. Is it feasible? Well, carbon tax and basic income combination is not in fact entirely new. There is something similar now in Canada. It's not the same. A carbon tax is 90% of the proceeds of a carbon tax are being recycled into a household dividend. That dividend is at the moment income tested, but what they have achieved is a process that's a total package that ensures that the carbon tax does not damage the disposable incomes of low-income households. Any carbon tax will increase costs, and that will damage disposable incomes of low-income households. The only solution is to provide a basic income as well. To provide it as a targeted income will dig people even deeper into poverty. And so it's a route not to go down. Would this be a financial burden on the youth? No, it would not if it was paid for out of new taxes, because the new taxes would pay for the basic income. It is important that basic income schemes should be fiscally neutral. They should be revenue neutral in the sense that the money to pay for them should be gathered today to pay for them today, so as not to impose a burden on future generations. To sum up, I think this is a brilliant project, and we shall all be watching it with great interest and very much hope that you will see it implemented. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your excellent comments and questions raised, Dr. Tori. And I think Dr. Yu and Dr. Choi will respond to them in the end of the session. So now we are going to move to the next commentator, Professor Jung-Woo Lee from Gyeongbuk National University.
Okay, very nice to meet you all. And this is a very important moment for Korean people. We are ahead of a very big election in 2 or 3 weeks. And Governor Lee's proposal of, do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Governor Lee's proposal of basic income is very modest one. It's it starts with a very small sum of money, and it will increase every year if people say it's okay. or if people oppose it, then he might reconsider and may drop it in the future. Nobody knows. One thing very clear is that basic income is based on the universalism. And the universalism is much better approach in reducing poverty and inequality than selectivism. It's a pity that there is lots of disagreement within Democratic Party, even though Democratic Party of Korea holds universalism as a key principle of welfare. Many people within that party is worried about the basic income idea. Of course, the people from People's Power Party, the opposition party, is much more opposed to that. Now that Korea is now faced with a very big inequality and its economy is now stagnating, and it's a very big chance to start with economic growth with this basic income experiment. And I think I am very optimistic that this experiment will be very successful, because it starts with a very small sum of money, and the people, even though they do not understand the idea very fully, not yet, but as time goes on, every year, 1 and 2 years, then people will understand the merit of that system, and there will be much more popular support in 2 or 3 years, I think. And the idea with some more emphasis on young people, 20s, is a good idea, I think, because young people are now facing a very big problems with employment and having jobs, or even they have some difficulty in marrying couples, or etc. They are in big trouble, so we need to support them more, and we need some extra money for young people in their 20s. And there's strong support for the children, that's no doubt about that, and the old people, the elderly, are really in great difficulty in Korea, so no doubt about that. But as for some categorical things about peasants or artists, there may be some disagreements. And I agree with Dr. Tori that there may be some other ideas about artists' basic income that I really agree. And about the negative income tax, I think the People's Power Party strongly support the negative income tax. But I think basic income is much better idea than negative income tax, because basic income has no work disincentive, while negative income tax, as for example supported by Milton Friedman, as Dr. Tori suggested, in his idea, the basic tax rate was about 50%, which means this is a very high tax rate, high marginal tax rate for the poor workers. And that shows that negative income tax is not a good idea in reducing poverty and inequality. And I think Governor Lee's basic income is much better idea, and people with the passage of time will understand the good things about it, and I have a very optimistic view about basic income in Korea in the future. Thank you for.
Thank you very much, Professor Lee. Probably we'll just move on quickly to Professor Namun Kang for further comment.
Let me share my slide. Sorry. Yeah. Opposition party candidate argues that youth basic income is a burden on younger generation. So in this round, I'd like to answer 3 questions. The first argument is that youth basic income is ineffective because the amount is small. But the basic income for youth is 1 million won a year, or 80,000 won per month. But it is 20 million won because it is received for 10 years. It's never a small amount. Second, recently, the average GPA of college students tends to be proportional to their parents' income. This is because wealthy college students can concentrate on studying for the exam without having to work part-time during the midterm or final exam. Youth basic income can give middle-class and low-income class students more time to avoid having to work part-time during midterm or final exams. As such, the youth basic income reduces the time inequality between rich students and middle and low-income college students. Third, most college students in advanced welfare countries receive student allowances and do not work part-time, but concentrate on their studies. Youth basic income helps to increase international competitiveness by extending the time for self-development of young people. The advantage of the student allowances in other countries is that it is paid to young people who are not college students. The second argument is that youth basic income is a burden on the younger generation. The first answer, the youth basic income is financed through general budget adjustment without tax increase. Lee Jae-myung's plans to raise funds by adjusting those used for the less effective and environmentally destructive or privileged in the general budget, or by utilizing the natural increase in the general budget. Therefore, there is no new tax to be borne by the younger generation. Second, since there is no tax increase for youth basic income, even if young people become middle-aged, their burden will not increase compared to the current middle-aged. Third, youth basic income is the conversion of expenditures that have been previously used elsewhere to expenditures for the youth, so the younger generation benefits from it without any burden. The third argument is the national basic income is a burden on the younger generation. National basic income is mainly composed of land dividends and carbon dividends. The land dividend is a policy that distributes the land value tax as a basic income to all citizens. Carbon dividend is a policy that distributes a portion of carbon tax revenue as basic income to all citizens. Land dividend and carbon dividends will be implemented after obtaining public consent through public debate. The land dividend is designed so that 90% of all households become net beneficiary. that is, they receive more money than they pay. Most of the younger generation do not have their own homes, so they become pure beneficiaries who only receive money without paying. Even if a young man becomes middle-aged and owns a house, he will still be a net beneficiary if he is not in the top 10%. The land dividend only makes the top 10% of real estate owners net payers. In this way, land dividend makes the top 10% of real estate owners, whether elderly or young, a net burden, and an overwhelming majority, whether old or young, as net beneficiaries. Of the younger generations, very few young people who own more than 1.5 billion to 1.7 billion homes become net payers. So these are my answers for now.
All right, thank you very much for your wonderful comments about the worries about the youth and the future generation. So since we have a little bit more time, we can take one more turn for panel comment, if you may. Professor Van Parijs or Dr. Malcolm Turi, do you have a further comment or question?
Yes, let me just come back to two of the issues. I would like to return to more of them, but I'll just focus on two. One is that I want to fully back what Malcolm said about in the case of the basic income for artists. In fact, in the book I published with Yannick van der Borgt on basic income, that has also been published in Korean, we explain why these so-called categorical basic incomes are very problematic. This holds for artists. In fact, there was an attempt in that direction made in the Netherlands to have a basic income for artists, and then it was dropped precisely because of the contentious nature of the cleavage between who is a real artist and who is not an artist. And so you'll have then a top-down bureaucracy that will decide who is a real artist. And of course, many artists are part-time artists. So where do you draw the boundary? It's very difficult. This holds also, to some extent, in different way, for rural residents. What is someone who lives in the countryside? Because we have suburban areas. So does it really depend on where you live and not on what your activity is? And so it can't be for farmers, it is for rural residents. So it's again a very difficult decision to make and to operationalize. So I fully back that, and I think this is definitely not the most promising aspect of the plan put forward by Governor Lee. The other comment I want to make is really on the importance of sort of real life experimentation, because it's sometimes said that one shouldn't engage in experiment with the whole of a country without having tried the whole proposal on a smaller scale. But it's impossible to draw consequences for what would happen on a large scale from what happens on a small scale for a small number of individuals. So can we jump then? Isn't it too risky to jump and force the whole, the millions of people who live in a country to take the risk of the experiment? And the answer is no. This is the only way to go forward, but to go forward in a modest way. In fact, the same happened in the 16th century, at the end of the 16th century, for what is now one central component of our welfare states, namely social assistance. So it was there were some local experiments, and then with the poor laws in England, there was first the first national scheme of social assistance, assistance targeted at the poor and organized by the public authorities. And then the same happened again at the end of the 19th century when Bismarck in Germany introduced the first social insurance system, which was no longer aid to the poor, but solidarity between workers. Before doing that, did they go for some randomized experiments in order to see what would happen if one introduced it. No, that did not. They introduced it for the whole population, but at a modest level. They started at a level that was very low compared to the social assistance and social insurance components of our current welfare states. And for the third model of social protection, namely basic income and social dividend, the same must happen. That is, started at a very modest level, prudently, in a responsible way, not through a very big jump with a basic income that will be sufficient to live on, even if you live on your own. No, very modestly. And this is what is being proposed in this plan. And indeed, it would be fantastic, not only for Korea, but also for the whole of the world, if someone, a courageous politician who has to face some lobbying, important lobbying, some incredulity on the part of many people, some courageous, intelligent politician could both have the vision and then see also pragmatically how to move forward. It would be the equivalent of what Bismarck has turned out to be for welfare state, the social insurance aspect of welfare state throughout the world. And so we'll be watching first the campaign and then hopefully the gradual implementation of the plan with the greatest interest and the greatest hope.
Thank you very much for a wonderful comment. And Dr. Torrey, do you have a further comment?
I do. Just a couple of things which haven't been mentioned so far. They're probably worth discussing. I've been sent Korean pressed comment, critical comment on the Governor Lee's proposal, particularly relating to the worry that employment market activity would fall in the presence of a basic income. We haven't discussed that yet, and clearly we should. It is true, as the article makes clear that I was sent, and this has been said fairly often, that a high basic income would reduce employment market activity. That's perfectly clear. That's not what anybody is discussing, either in the Korean proposal or in any of the feasible basic income proposals researched in the UK or elsewhere. A smaller basic income would be more likely to increase employment market activity, particularly if it took people off existing means-tested benefits, because the current social assistance systems in many countries reduce the amounts paid out fall as earned income rises, which reduces employment market incentives, whereas a basic income would not reduce those incentives. And so, and the pilot project evidence from Namibia, India, and now Finland suggests that employment market activity would be likely to increase in the presence of a small basic income. And it's a small one that you are discussing. Therefore, the press comment that I've seen is irrelevant. And I think that those of you who are supporting Governor Lee's proposal should be public in saying that press comment relating to a high basic income is irrelevant to this proposal. I think you need to be clear with your journalists. One other thing to say is you are proposing a gradual approach, and I think that's absolutely right. It's not simply public opinion that you will need to evaluate as each new stage is considered. The reason is, as we have discovered when we have researched feasible basic income schemes in the UK and elsewhere in Europe, that it is quite easy accidentally to impose net income losses on low-income households. Sometimes the implementation of a basic income in combination with new taxes can impose losses on low-income households. And we have found that to be the case in our research. So what is important is to ensure that each new stage increases the net incomes of low-income households when the combination of the basic income and taxation is considered. That research will be just as important as opinion surveys. I think that's perfectly feasible to do. We have proved that there are feasible basic income schemes in the UK and elsewhere in Europe. And your scheme looks to me entirely feasible in that respect. And I think it can continue to be so as the different stages progress over the next few years. Yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Tori. It's very encouraging to hear that small amount of basic income actually can increase the market activities. That might probably persuade a lot of economists and opponents in Korea. Thank you. And now can we move to Professor Jung Lee or Namun Kang for further comment?
Yes, I fully agree with Philip and Malcolm that starting with small money of basic income is very important. And one thing I want to point out is that the national poll in Switzerland years ago was unsuccessful. And the basic reason, I think, was the amount of money given to people was too much. It was more than $2,000 a month, which was, I think, too big money to start. And fortunately, in Governor Lee's idea, the starting sum of money is very small, and it's scheduled to be gradually up. And we have a high chance of success in Korea. That's a very important point, I think. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Professor Kang, do you have further comment?
Yes, let me answer one more question. Yeah. I'd like to answer the argument that carbon dividends are burden on the younger generation. As mentioned above, carbon dividend is a policy of distributing a portion of carbon tax revenue as basic income to all citizens. As for carbon dividends, approximately 70% of all households will be net beneficiaries. Since the younger generation use less carbon than the older generation, about 90% of the youth are net beneficiaries. Achieving carbon neutrality without a carbon tax is almost impossible. If carbon neutrality is not achieved, the younger generation will have to bear the full burden of climate crisis when they reach middle age. The younger generation must live on an earth where agriculture is impossible. In other words, if carbon neutrality is not achieved, the current generation of young people will have to live on a planet that cannot support 7 billion people. Since Korea is a manufacturing-oriented country, it is more difficult to achieve carbon neutrality. Korea is also an export-oriented country, so if it fails to achieve carbon neutrality, it will have to pay a high carbon border tax. Our economy will definitely decline in the future. These are the costs the younger generation will have to bear if the carbon dividend policy is not introduced now. If carbon neutrality is achieved through carbon dividends, the younger generation will receive enormous benefits as they will inherit an economy with a strong manufacturing industry and a land where agriculture is possible. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now before I'm going to the floor questions, let us ask Dr. Yu and Dr. Che for responses for the panel comments and questions.
Okay, shall I respond to the questions about basic income for artists and also for rural residents? So I shared the concerns about the basic income for artists. So there could be disputes about who qualifies as an artist or not. So the also it's not consistent with the principles of basic income, like universalism and unconditionality. So I think probably it's more like a participation income, and it'll be run as artists' allowance for creative activities or something like that. So currently the plan is Korean Artists Welfare Foundation will determine who qualify for the allowance. So the name basic income is a bit misnamed. So and there is a debate about whether we should introduce basic income for farmers or rural residents. So initially, the proposal was basic income for farmers, which again will raise disputes about who would qualify as a farmer. And the rationale for rural residents is not universal, but it's not conditional. So only condition you reside in rural areas, and Korea has a problem of a very low fertility rate, and which especially low fertility in rural areas is not just rural low fertility. So there is a migration from rural areas to urban areas. So rural areas are in the crisis of population extinction. So that's why we need basic income for rural residents. And basic income for rural residents is not only beneficial for rural residents, I think it's beneficial for urban residents as well. One of the big problems in urban areas, especially Seoul, is skyrocketing housing prices. So since many rural people come to urban areas, so there is we have many empty houses in rural areas, but in the city, the housing price is going up. So if rural basic income helps retain rural population, that can ameliorate the real estate problem in rural urban areas. Also, urban areas have provide more opportunities, but also very intense competition, and it creates many losers. So when you become losers in urban competition, you have a fallback option as rural areas, and rural basic income hence will help urban residents as well as rural residents. Thank you. And I see Timothy Martin from Wall Street Journal.
Thank you, Dr. Yu. And Dr. Choi, do you have further responses?
I will just have some short comment on all of your questions raised, and thank you so much for your great comments and then your interest. I think we all agree with the importance of the UBI, but also the challenges and difficulty of adopting UBI in a country, like any countries, and also including Korea. Our candidate Lee proposed in the beginning two new or adventurous plan, but after several rounds of discussion and receiving criticism, we came up with a feasible and practical plan. So this might not be enough amount, or might not be the whole picture that you initially thinking about the UBI, but I hope this is a good start, and hopefully we have a very scientific evaluation of this categorical UBI or area UBI. So I hope that we can build a consensus among the citizens to expand it in a nationwide. So that's my just a remark on your comments. And I have to excuse myself. I need to run for the radio talk because we are right before the election. So let me excuse myself first. Thank you, everyone.
Right.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I know we are several minutes behind, but so we can excuse panelists and speakers if you have to leave, but it would be very kind if you remain a few minutes more for follow-up questions and comments. Really. So yeah, so it's time for Q&A session for online participants, and I think there are, as Dr. Yu mentioned, journalists, including Mr. Tim Martin from Wall Street Journal, and also Basic Income Korea Network, who which sponsored this event very kindly. Dr. An Hyo-sang is present, and also Dr. Yu Young-sung, Dr. Young-sung Yu from Gyeonggi Research Institute is present too. So if you have comments and questions, please come forward now.
Moderator Lee?
Yeah. Yes, yes.
Klaus,
Yes, Dr. Han.
Klaus raised his hand.
Oh, yeah. So do you have a comment, Dr. An, first, or?
Yeah. Can I?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
And then later,
yeah.
Klaus. Yeah.
Can I use 3 or 4 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak, and I'd like to thank both speakers and other panelists. Today's title, "Will South Korea be the first country to introduce universal basic income?" is very fascinating topic. So at the beginning, Professor Yu said he is excited, but I have to say I am very depressed because the atmosphere is very tough. 2 speakers said that candidate Lee is in a dead heat in the polls, but the trend shows that he is waging a difficult battle at a disadvantaged position. The speakers presented the political and socio-economic backgrounds in which basic income agenda has risen. I will speak about the current situation in which basic income and candidate who has pledged to introduce a basic income scheme are in trouble using the concept of populist moment. I remember the year 2016 was a series of significant events that helped basic income ideas surfaced. AlphaGo beat human prayer, Swiss referendum, news of basic income experiment from Finland. I have to include the BN Congress in Seoul. Moreover, the candlelight revolution that began in the fall of that year led to the impeachment of the president. And this would be the backdrop for a new socio-economic agenda to emerge from the ashes of neoliberalism. However, from the viewpoint of the world history, the year 2016 would be remembered as the advent of populist moment. We can see it in Brexit and Trump's win in the presidential election in the United States. Seeing both aspects of the year 2016, it seems that the time of Korea and the time of world history are not matched, but 2 interrelated causes render Nemesis, the goddess of revenge, to come in. On the one hand, Democratic Party, the ruling part, has not been able to carry out resolute reform. On the other hand, so-called candlelight revolution stopped at the gate of socio-economic reform, constraining itself to small political change. We can say the genuine, the socio-economic background in which basic income idea has risen could not be changed, which would be no support for progressive agenda, including basic income, but the moment at which right populism could emerge. Recently, we have seen the rise of populism in the expression of conflicts between generations and between genders, superficially. In particular, a kind of culture war regarding gender equality does not improve the position of women and other minorities. Instead, it provides fuel to drive the expansion of right populism. We can also watch the pervasion of anti-social feminism and atomized individualism. This gave birth to a younger generation who think it is difficult to find stability in life and hope for the future in other way than investing. I have to say speculating in real estates and stocks. This trend and atmosphere allow the political force who have tried to gather supporters through the politics of resentment to return. This is the situation in Korea that I want to speak about with the concept of populist movement. This situation would hinder the progress of every progressive agenda as well as basic income. Two speakers' presentation begin with the quotation from Philip and Yannick, which emphasizes an efficient cooperation between thinkers, activists, thinkers, and courageous and intelligent politicians to introduce basic income. Obviously, this kind of cooperation could bring basic income agenda in Korea to the place where it stands. Now we have to ask a question like this. Why are people not accepting or mistaking basic income despite the time and situation demanded? Whatever the outcome we may have in March, we have to find a way to broaden and strengthen the support for basic income freshly. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Klaus Samber, did you raise your hand? Maybe you can hear a few comments and questions, and then back to the panelists again, and then wrap up, okay?
Okay, I only have a short statement. I say you can avoid the discussion about who is an artist and who is not an artist and so on. If you do it immediately, that we want to have an unconditional basic income for all. So you have not this problem anymore. And I am not in agreement that we should start with a small amount because the full advantages for the income, for unconditional basic income is not given if you start with small amount. And if the political will is given, it is possible to finance it. I'm completely sure we have different calculations that shows that it is possible. Thank you for this possibility to mention it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? Anyone? So if there is none, can you go back to panelists and speakers to respond to comments and questions raised? Did you want to say something, Professor Van Parijs?
Yeah, okay, sorry. I wasn't sure you were waiting for me. Yes, I would just like to add a comment to what Professor Yu said about the rural residents. And of course, I understand the reasoning, but the paradox, of course, is that people in the rural areas where accommodation is cheaper, where housing is cheaper, will receive a sort of benefit, which people in urban areas where housing is more expensive will receive nothing, or will only receive the basic amount if that is introduced. So, I mean, I can't see how this can be made politically sustainable, because the people in urban areas, and there'll be growing numbers of them, will say, why give this privilege to people in the countryside? Now, of course, any basic income scheme of a general sort, even any sort of income guarantee, even means tested, will mean a redistribution from the cities to the countryside. And I just mentioned that a long time ago, I went to see President Fernando Henrique Cardoso, President of Brazil before Lula, together with Senator Suplicy, in order to try to convince him that it was important to have federal national funding of the few experiments of income guarantee that had started in some municipalities. And what convinced Cardoso was precisely your argument, because then he went for co-funding by the federal state, by national state of Brazil, and that's the scheme that then led to the Bolsa Familia under Lula. And what convinced him is precisely your argument that so providing this income guarantee throughout the country will enable people from the countryside to stay in the countryside rather than to flock into overcrowded cities. So it was a way of reducing the pressure on, in particular, the poorer neighborhoods of the city. So this argument was present, but the way to address it, it seems to me, is really by lifting gradually the basic income that is available for everyone, because otherwise you will not only have discussions about where the rural area starts, and so I mean, it's only the poor rural areas, but also the richer ones. You'll have discussions about that, but also resentment on the part of the people living in cities where housing is more expensive towards the people in the countryside, where some people are relatively rich compared to some poor people in the richer parts. And if you have it for everyone, well, there will be redistribution from the cities to the countryside, because average income in cities is higher, and therefore you have a contribution to stabilizing the population in rural areas. And so that I understand the motivation, but I think it remains a weak aspect, I think, in the set of proposals by Governor Lee.
All right, there is still room for debate, right? And see, probably I can give you probably last opportunity to comment or ask questions for the floor. Dr. Yu Young-sung or Mr. Tim Martin, do you have any further comment or question?
Yep. Do you hear me? My name is Young-sung Yu. Okay?
Yes.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
So I would like to mention two things shortly. It's related to what happened in Korea in reality. Okay? The first one is some economists, including the Nobel laureates Banerjee and Duflo, have insisted it would be better for Korea to target its population in need, while developing countries with limited capacity had better provide universal basic income. I don't agree with their opinions. It sounds true, yeah, that Korea's relatively advanced government system and digital technology adoption could reduce the cost and inefficiency around the targeting. However, we need to listen to the vivid voices in the real field. According to the journal report, at the time of the first disaster relief payment, many public officials in charge of related tasks, including the head of a certain metropolitan local government, so-called Gyeongsangnam-do governor, Kim Kyung-soo, confessed the inefficient administrative system. The reality is that the administration has been almost paralyzed for nearly a month since the first disaster relief payment project was implemented. This is the first one. And the second one is it is a question of why targeting and universality should be recognized and selected in a dichotomy. Shouldn't it be possible to make a universal payment first and then sort through the tax settlement method later? This method was argued by some scholars, including Governor Lee Jae-myung at the time, but it was not accepted in reality. The reality is that if there is a confrontation between the political camps, the place for rational policy measures is extremely narrowed. This is my opinion. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Do you have any last comment or question from the floor, from the online audience?
Hi, this is Timothy Martin from the Wall Street Journal. I don't have a question. I know we are over our allotted time, but I just wanted to thank all of the panelists and participants for very robust and interesting conversation about UBI. It's a conversation that's even occurred in the US in its political and presidential cycle, and being based in Seoul, and now very much so focused on the elections. I just want to thank everyone for providing their perspective and bringing attention to this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Martin. That was Tim Martin from Wall Street Journal. And so then probably this is the time for speakers. If you have one last comment. Dr. Jong Sung-yu or Dr. Malcolm Torrey?
Yes, I have a comment. I very much appreciate you were saying Arm's comments on the current situation. I think there is a great deal of truth in that, and it is not the easiest moment for the discussion of what we might call initiatives that may look a bit strange. In an insecure time, we all of us have a tendency to go back to some golden past, and really it didn't exist, but that is much of the feeling behind the populist mood. And last year, the Gyeonggi Research Institute ran a very useful and interesting conference, and I was asked to speak about the relationship between basic income and capitalism. And what I suggested then, and it's just as true now, is that capitalism, which is at the heart of the Republic of Korea's success, would benefit considerably from a basic income, as well as being slowly transformed by it. The reason it would benefit from a basic income relates to one of my earlier comments on the employment market. Basic income is an unusual policy in the sense that it could make the employment market more flexible at the same time as making individuals' incomes more secure. It is very unusual in that respect. And one of the advantages of basic income that you might wish to emphasize in Korea is precisely that the capitalist Korean model would benefit from a basic income. It's not that it would overturn it in any way. It would enable it to thrive more easily at the same time as benefiting the population of Korea, and particularly low-income households. And I commend that argument to you.
Yeah, let me make.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Let me make.
After you first, and then Professor
Yeah.
Van Parijs.
Let me address two issues. The first one is about negative income tax. Actually, I have a slightly different opinion or information about the negative income tax discussion in Korea. So PPP, the conservative party, Yoon Suk-yeol's party, actually doesn't support negative income tax or basic income. So Yoon Suk-yeol opposes both the basic income and the negative income tax. While Yoo Seung-min and Oh Se-hun, some of the politicians affiliated with the PPP endorses negative income tax, but they are minority at the moment. And Justice Party, Shim Sang-jung, proposes a version of negative income tax, which she calls minimum income for the citizens scheme. So it's a negative income tax. And actually, that's a significant thing because previously, Justice Party and their support base, the progressive scholars, didn't like negative income tax. But they recognized the problems of a current social welfare system, which has negative incentives for working. So they think negative income tax is better than current welfare system. And I fully agree with Professor Lee and others that basic income is much better than negative income tax. But I think negative income tax has some elements, some significant elements that share the ideas with the basic income and share same criticism against the current welfare system. So I think we can discuss Justice Party's negative income tax as well as some other versions of negative income tax as well as basic income. And secondly, with regard to basic income for rural residents, I share Philip's concerns. But in Korea, the rural situation is really on the verge of extinction. So some slight, small amount of additional basic income might be good, as I think Philip agrees with the basic income for the disabled, something like that. So there is not clear, I don't know, who will qualify as disabled might be a problem, but usually people with disabilities need more income. In the same sense, rural residents may need a little bit more support. And another thing I want to emphasize is the financing for rural basic income will not come from additional burden of urban residents. So currently, there is a lot of budget for rural and agriculture, and also for balanced development between the urban and rural areas, which are misspent, which are misused. So using those agricultural and rural budget wisely, which are misused for rural residents, so that will be beneficial for both rural residents as well as urban residents. So that's my response. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Van Parijs, and then we should wrap up.
Okay, quick last word. First of all, I agree with what you just said, because of my general conviction that the worst way of trying to go forward is to be a purist. That is, where you say either we want the whole thing or nothing at all. The whole thing being a high basic income for everyone, really universal. No, we need to be pragmatic. And so there may be many ways of going forward. And indeed, there may be a way of reviving some parts of the countryside that are completely, going to being completely depopulated. And then you introduce it there. Or indeed, what you said about a negative income tax, I don't think we should reject it as such if it's a way of moving forward. It's not only Milton Friedman who defends a negative income tax, it's also Thomas Piketty, for example, in France today. His version of a basic income is in fact a negative income tax. Of course, he doesn't want to call it like that, but again, he sees it, he also sees the advantages of a pure basic income, but he sees some political advantage in moving in that direction. Now, this does not mean that it's not good to have people like Klaus, or indeed like the German entrepreneur Götz Werner, who just died, who say we should go for 1,000 euros or over $1,000 per month. We need people to pull in that direction. But to take the example of Götz Werner, he's an entrepreneur, he's not a politician, and politicians have a responsibility towards their population. They can't just take risks, not just for themselves or their business, but for the whole of the country. And so therefore it's okay to have people like Götz Werner who are far more radical than Governor Lee. But Götz Werner's key point, and that to return to the pessimism also expressed by Yo Sang, Götz Werner's key point is really the importance of freedom, and the real freedom which is given through a basic income, also for the sake of economic efficiency. And so in the current context, in which we see that because of the pandemic, because of climate change, our freedom will need to be restricted and is already restricted in all sorts of ways, we must say, no, there is room for a future in which there will be more freedom for the people with least freedom today. And a basic income, however we get to it, is a central part of the model of a society that we can look forward despite all the challenges around it. And freedom can be a central part of it, and in a sustainable way, in a realistic way, because this freedom can be used through lifelong learning, through commitments to work, through people investing in their human capital with far more opportunities. It can be used also for the sake of economic productivity, not only, but also, of course, for the sake of social justice.
Right.
Thank you very much. Oh, that was tight.
Yeah.
It's short time, but it was, I think, very productive. We pointed to a lot of problems and solutions about universal basic income. I think we share the perspective that the basic income proposal in Korea is very meaningful and feasible. So thank you very much, Korea Inequality Research Lab staff and Lab 2050 Lab for today's organization, co-hosting this event, and also Korea Basic Income Korea Network for sponsoring this event, and the speakers, of course, and then participants. Thank you very much for participating. And let's wrap up this session with Van Parijs's last comment, which was very impressive for me, actually. It is not the fear of starvation, but the power of freedom, which will lead us to the future society and probably happiness and better quality of life. So thank you very much. let's wrap it up.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you, Marco. See you.
Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.